Okay, so case into New Jersey, we prepared our presentation on the Rock Springs Massacre, which occurred in the 19th century. It was one of the first hate crimes committed against the Asian American communities. And uh, during the event, the effect it had, some people involved in some primary text, the government response, and of that Rock Springs area, which had at the time of Vietnamese American community. And yeah, so this is Rock Springs. It's a city located in South Wyoming. And its population as of now of around 2021 has about 20,000. And it has a history of coal mining, and many workers work there to mine coal, including Chinese immigrant workers. Many, the California Gold Rush, any sort of way, which included coal mining and other sorts of considered cheap labor by Americans, and they didn't receive proper protection from the government or the legal system. And they often worked under really dangerous conditions for minimum wages, such as in the coal mines, and they weren't really given proper treatment compared to the other workers that also worked in similar conditions. So due to these migrant workers by 1885, the just workers outnumbered the whites in Rock Springs from about 600 to 300. Their separate lives. The Chinese established Chinatowns compared to the original towns in the area, and then they live very separate lives. And in the Chinatowns, they formed their own communities, and many found work as coal miners. And it was throughout the United States, pay and better conditions. But they saw the Asian Americans competition that was used to lower wages. This is because Asian workers, especially in this Chinese coal miners, were willing to work for less wages. And this strikes that they kind of built up kind of hate between the coal miners and their union versus the Chinese and Asian communities around these coal mines. So here's the causes. Like I said before, go more in depth about the hate between the Chinese at the time. China wanted to strike for better working conditions and better wages, but the Chinese laborers, when offered to strike together, they simply refused because they were satisfied with the dangerous working conditions. Several beating Chinese men happened like due to similar reasons. Several beatings of Chinese men happened in neighboring cities, such as Chain, Maury, and Lawrence, Rollins, and there were other sorts of threats. So there was another strike in 1884 by the white workers. The mine managers, knowing that the laborers would be willing to work for cheaper and for more dangerous conditions, they decided to instruct the managers in Rock Springs because that would save money. And that's photo is the year of the night they were during the massacre. So the tension between Pacific coal mine at Rock Springs. And for years, the union could not strike for better conditions due to the reasons explained before, because the Chinese were not willing to work because they were willing to work for worse conditions. And they were quick to blame the Chinese. The Union Pacific wanted to pay for materials and tools at their overpriced stores, which led to negotiations with the Knights of Labor Union, although claiming try and solve this issue. So the Knights of Labor and the Union Pacific, the company, had many issues with each other. And the Knights of Labor began blaming the Chinese migrant workers for the wage problem and the working conditions problem. Okay. Right now. Okay. So the Union Pacific had originally bought the Chinese Chinese workers as strikebreakers, like we said before, because they were for less wages. So they showed little interest in being part of the union. And uh, and a strikebreaker, by definition, is someone that works despite others being on strike, which effectively makes the strike inactive. And here's the which took place in a very short time. So on September 2nd, 1880, a fight broke out between the number 6 mine in Rock Springs. A Chinese member was fatally wounded by a pickaxe, and another was really badly beaten. And after leaving the mines, the white workers from their home to retrieve one towards the Chinese across the plank bridge and the other approaching by the railroad bridge. The Chinatown was quickly surrounded for the most part. Well, in the Chinatown weren't aware of what was about to happen, as it was a national holiday and the majority of them stayed home from work. So this eventually resulted in the death of bloody, racially motivated massacres against Chinese miners when they decomposed and were being eaten by dogs and hogs. So here's the effects of the massacre. So a significant amount of workers went out of work, both white and Chinese workers. The Chinese workers, this trying to avoid this anymore, migrated to the American West, but they're much better and they still face racism and discrimination. And more acts were also inspired by the massacre. And Chinese settlements were raided. For example, Chinese settlements, a Chinese was raided in Coal Creek, September 11th, which is about a week later. In Newcastle, Washington, a mob of whites burned down the barracks of Chinese. And Chinese workers also were chased out in Oregon and Washington around late 1885 to 1886. And there were so the whites as the miners and white would begin violently driving them away. So these are some of the white organizations that were responsible for these acts. It's the Yoda 15 in charge of organizing expulsion of Chinese in 1885, and Tacoma's 21, which indicated and later became free of charge of the felony conspiracy in Tacoma around 1885, which, like I mentioned before, drove all workers out of Tacoma in the area. Here's some people involved in the Thomas Patty Nagel. He was a white miner and the leader of the Knights of Labor. He was vocal about and inciting violence against the Chinese miners. Robert Bruce superintendent of the Union Pacific Coal Company was responsible for hiring the Chinese laborers. Its decisions contributed to the tensions between us because before the Union of Knights of Labor was blamed the Chinese, and the governor at the time of the governor of Wyoming at the time was Francis E. Warren, and he could, but didn't act really strong enough to prevent the deaths. Eugene Slack was attorney for the District of Wyoming at the time, and led to the prosecution against the individuals charged with crime related to the massacre. The Union Pacific coal mines in Rock Springs, his efforts were not very effective, and the sheriff Edward H. was the local officer at the time, and criticized him for not doing enough to prevent the Chinese from being massacred at the time. So here's some primary text and what this shows about the initial event. In the doc, the Chinese explains how the officers of the company were nice to them, but stated they were approached, which also contributed to the animosity. And were also included in the text. Again, more than 10 white men ran into which led to more white foremen of the pit calling up for work. This, of course, led to hate. And more documents state that the attack started at 2. And many lost lives. Those who survived lost money. And a direct quote states that it was a sad and painful sight to see the son crying for the father, brother for the brother, the uncle for the nephew. They understood some of the reasons, including that they were not prepared at all. They did not hear of the attack, so they were surprised. They did not have any defensive weapons to defend themselves. They proceeded to thank the president and troops, and in their account, their miners listed all the dead bodies from the president to your honor. So here's what the government say about and nearly $150,000 in damages, and pressure from the president, President Cleveland. It's and over time, the Chinese gradually left Wyoming, as mentioned before, because they want to avoid them return to their home countries. The federal troops built Camp to prevent further violence, and which stayed there for more than 13 years, which stayed there for 13 more years. And although Governor urged to reduce the death toll, he tricked the Chinese onto trains that took Rock Springs. So obviously the government, though they did respond to the issue fundamentally, and also led to other hate crimes motivated by the to race. So anti-Chinese feelings shared by many Americans at the time was shared by Americans at the time, and it was already present from the Continental Railroad, because many Chinese workers were considered a source of cheap labor, placed many of the white workers, which again created tensions between the white workers and the Chinese workers. There was also a racist created, not a Chinaman's chance. which sprouted from dangerous working conditions and scenic cliffs. California's Anti-Coolie Act, which required Chinese immigrants to work in the state, which prevented more Chinese workers from having a good condition or making enough money. And other laws were enacted, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned Chinese workers from entering the United States, and the country's first federal legislature to suspend immigration on the basis of a specific nationality, which was the Chinese. And other instances of anti-Asian racism continued throughout American history, such as the American internment camps during World War II, or the LA riots in 1992, and hate crimes during the COVID-19 pandemic, with claims such as the Chinese virus, it being a Chinese virus, and claiming of like Kung Flu. Those things also contributed to Asian hate in general. It's our presentation. Thank you for your time.